I'm so glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. They called me dramatic for crying, so I called the lawyer they feared the most. It was over nothing, really. It's what my daughter-in-law kept saying. She had that kind of smile. It's the one you learn to stop trusting after you've seen it long enough. Tight at the corners, sharp in the center. She said I was making a scene because I'd asked if I could keep the bench from the garden when they moved me into the guest house. She said it with her arms crossed and her eyes on her phone. When I started crying, my son just sighed like one. It was a bad signal in a place with no reception. The bench had been mine. I'd stained it myself with a brush and a dish towel out on the back lawn in 1989. My husband was still alive then. The boys had been little and loud and barefoot. It was the first thing we owned that wasn't handed down or borrowed or broken. And I was supposed to leave it behind because it didn't match the new aesthetic of their modern backyard. That was the beginning. Not of the betrayal that had started long before, but the beginning of me opening my eyes all the way. I raised my son with steady hands and sleepless nights. My own mother used to say I clung too tightly, but I don't think that was ever true. I gave him everything I had, just like most mothers do. I said no to myself for 25 years so I could say yes to him. He was never spoiled, but he was never hungry either. And when his wife came into the picture, I folded myself. Smaller, so there would be room for her too. At first, she was sweet. Polite in that crisp way that doesn't always mean warmth. She asked about my meatloaf recipe and offered to help clean the porch. I thought we'd get there eventually. But some women don't want to share. They want to replace. I noticed little things. The picture of me holding him at his college graduation disappeared from the hallway. Replaced with one of the two of them on a boat somewhere I'd never been invited. I wasn't included in group texts anymore. I'd find out about family dinners the day after. Someone posted a blurry photo of the table. And when I asked about it, my son would say something like, "You're always so tired these days, Mom." He used to call me every Sunday. Then every other. Then once a month. Then only when he needed the name of an old insurance agent or a copy of a deed I still kept in my drawer. One afternoon, was sitting in the kitchen of the guest house, which they insisted on calling the casita, and I heard them through the open window. My daughter-in-law was saying she didn't think I even remembered my own passwords anymore. That it would be easier to manage my affairs if things were simplified. Her word, not mine. I didn't move. Just sat there and stared at the plant I'd brought with me from the old house. The leaves had started to curl in. A week later, a letter came. It was addressed to me, but the handwriting on the envelope was my son's. Inside was a form from a bank I didn't use anymore, transferring control of something I didn't remember authorizing. There was a signature at the bottom that looked like mine, but I hadn't touched a pen in days. I let the kettle boil over that night, not out of forgetfulness, but out of rage. The steam curled against the window like something trying to get out. I started looking through everything I had left. Drawers, envelopes, my filing box with the green tabs. I stayed up for 2 nights reading fine print by lamplight. I was looking for what I already knew in my bones. They were moving pieces behind my back, assuming I wouldn't notice, or worse, assuming I wouldn't understand. They thought the tears meant I was weak. They didn't know they were only the water before the storm. I remembered a name. James Alder. He'd been our family lawyer 20 years ago when we updated the will after my husband passed. He had hands like folded maps, every line full of direction. He retired to a smaller firm, but he still answered his own phone. I told him everything. He didn't ask if I was sure. He asked where I wanted to meet. It was a quiet meeting. No drama. No yelling. Just papers. He showed me what I could revoke. What I could revise. He helped me take back control with a kind of precision that doesn't need to raise its voice to cut through a lie. When I confronted them, gently. Carefully, my son looked away and said he didn't know what I was talking about. My daughter. Said I was tired again, confused maybe. I reminded them both that the woman they thought was slipping had just signed new Kate power of attorney forms that did not include either of them. They didn't expect that. I started reaching out to the neighbors, who used to wave and say they missed seeing me at the front window. I got a referral for a financial advisor. I moved accounts. I moved titles. I made a call about the deed to the house. They didn't realize it was still in my name. When it all came to a head, it wasn't in a courtroom. It was at their dinner table, the same one I'd bought them as. A wedding gift. My lawyers sat beside me. They sat across, confused and cornered. I explained everything clearly, legally. That I was not stepping down, that I was not signing anything else, that I was not confused, I was calm. I was steady. The next day, I packed a small suitcase, left the guest house key on the counter. I took my bench with me, the one they said didn't fit. It fit just fine in the back of the van I rented. I found a small home 2 towns over. It's quiet, and the kitchen faces east. The mornings pour in gently. I hung up the picture from the graduation in the hallway. I see it every day. I changed my will, not out of spite, but out of wisdom. I named the people who had held me up when I was falling, the neighbor who brought me soup, the friend who checked on me from 3 states away. They get the plants. It's the bench, the dishes. It's the parts of me that mattered. I kept crying, but not because I was broken, because I was healing. When you've spent your life mothering someone, the lines blur. What's yours? What's theirs? What you gave away willingly and what they took without asking. It all starts to feel like one long breath you forgot to exhale. I never counted the hours or the dollars or the things I gave up. That's the kind of ledger mothers aren't supposed to keep. But the truth is, I remember it all. I remember saying no to a job offer because my son was starting school. And I wanted to be the one waiting at the gate when the bell rang. I remember selling the gold earrings my mother left me so we could pay for his braces when the insurance came up short. I remember canceling a trip I'd been planning for a decade, Paris, just for me, because he lost his job and needed help with the rent. I remember every single yes I said, even when my mouth tasted like no dot. And I remember the first time I noticed he stopped thanking me. He was 29. We were sitting at the kitchen table. I'd made him his favorite lentil stew with garlic bread, the way his grandmother used to make. He was scrolling on his phone while I served him. Said something about the food, something light, trying to make him look up. He just nodded barely. No eye contact, no warmth, just a hum of acknowledgement, like I was a waitress in a place he didn't plan to return to. The shift wasn't loud. It was a series of tiny silences. He got married the next year. She was tall and always wore something pressed. I liked her well enough at the start. She had the kind of presence that filled a room quickly, confident, efficient, always moving a little faster than everyone else. I admired that, till I started realizing there was no room left once she entered. At the rehearsal dinner, she gave a speech. She talked about their future, their travels, their plans. When she mentioned family, she said she was so excited too. Have a second mother now? His godmother, Lillian. Everyone clapped. I smiled. But something inside me shifted quietly, like a painting sliding off a nail on the wall. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. After they got married, the invitations slowed down. They said they were busy, adjusting, figuring out their rhythm. I understood. I told myself it was just the season of life. People pull away and come back. That's what I kept repeating. Even as the texts dried up and the photos they shared with others never reached me. At Christmas 2 years ago, I showed up with a gift wrapped in gold foil. A hand-stitched baby blanket I'd made when I thought, just maybe, there might be news. She opened it slowly, looked at it like it was something she hadn't ordered. She thanked me politely and then whispered to my son as they stood by the sink. That night, I found the blanket folded inside the laundry room cabinet, still wrapped. I didn't say anything, just went home and sat in the dark for a long time. There's a particular pain that comes when you realize someone has stopped seeing you as human. You don't scream. You don't break things. You just stop feeling like you belong in rooms you used to build with your own hands. I tried to talk to him once. I asked if something had changed, if I'd done something wrong. She was uncomfortable with me, or if maybe I'd said something I shouldn't have. He looked at me like I'd asked about the weather on a planet he didn't live on. He said, I was overthinking. He said maybe I was a little too sensitive these days, that I should rest more, that I wasn't getting any younger, and sometimes I got worked up over things that didn't matter. That was the moment. The mask falling, not all at once, but slowly, like ash. He used to call me after every big decision when he applied for college, when he bought his first car, when he thought he might propose. Now, I learned about milestones through other people's posts, a new business, a trip to Japan, a remodel on the house I helped them afford. I had co-signed the loan when the bank hesitated. He had tears in his eyes when he asked me, said it was temporary, said they just needed a little help. To qualify, I said yes, because that's what mothers do. And then, once it was done, they changed the locks before I'd even seen the new kitchen. The guest house was the compromise, a neat way to tuck me out of the way. They made it sound like a gift, a private space, just for me. But it had no mailbox, no real stove, no sense of permanence. It was a holding pen with linen curtains and a cracked step no one ever repaired. And yet, I still set it up like a home. I brought my photos, the dishware with the faded floral edges, the tablecloth. I had hemmed myself in the 70s. I baked bread. I kept the porch swept. I tried, but trying only works if someone's waiting on the other end of the effort. They weren't. They had moved on from me. While still keeping me in reach for convenience, for image, for whatever security I gave them by being nearby, but voiceless. I didn't realize how far gone I was until I called a friend one morning and she said, gently, that she hadn't heard from me in 6 months, that she thought maybe I had moved. I hadn't. I'd just stopped being seen, the isolation. Didn't happen overnight. It was a drip, a slow removal. My name left off of cards. My seat at the table moved closer to the edge. My calls answered less and less until I stopped making them. When you stop being expected, start disappearing. And still, when I cried just once, they looked at me like I was the problem. But I wasn't confused. I wasn't weak. I wasn't wrong. I was just finally done pretending that silence was kindness. And I was ready to speak with the kind of clarity that doesn't need noise to make its meaning known. Next came the letter, the discovery, the kettle. But before all that, there was this. The quiet realization that I had raised a man who no longer saw me as his mother, but as a burden with a heartbeat. And that hurt more than anything. The first time the word rest started to feel like an insult was at breakfast. It was a Sunday morning, and I had gone over to the main house with a plate of blueberry muffins I'd baked the night before. I still remember how warm they were when I tucked the cloth over the top, how soft the butter was in the dish I carried. I knocked gently. I used to just walk in, but at some point I'd been demoted to a guest without notice. She answered the door, hair pulled back, one of those little headbands holding it in place. She smiled like she always did, wide, pleasant, vacant. Said something about how sweet I was to bring those, then glanced at the kitchen and said they'd already eaten. I stood there for a second, holding the plate between us like a peace offering that had expired. Then she added in that gentle, sugary way of hers that maybe I should go rest. That it looked like I'd been going a bit too hard lately. I didn't know what that meant. I baked muffins. I sat alone in the guest house and watered a plant. I called my sister once a week and listened to the same voicemail from my cousin on repeat. Rest from what, exactly? I smiled, too. I said something about freezing the muffins that they kept. Well, and I went back across the lawn, the way I always did, slowly, like I didn't mind. Like I hadn't just been told again that my presence was a little too much before noon. It happened again the next week. This time, it was my son. I'd called to ask about a doctor's appointment I thought I'd heard him mention. Something. Routine, I'm sure. I wasn't prying, just asking. He picked up, sounded rushed. Said he was in a meeting and could we talk later? I said, of course. I always said, of course. Then I heard her in the background, just faintly, saying something like she's calling again. Does she ever just rest? That word again, rest. The code they used when they didn't want to say what they really meant. Retreat, disappear, fade. I started noticing it more. When they'd cancel dinner at the last minute, they'd say I probably needed to rest anyway. When I asked if I could tag along to the hardware store or help pick paint colors for the bathroom, they'd say it was a long trip and maybe I'd prefer to stay home and rest. I began to feel like furniture that needed covering, something old and delicate, best kept in the corner under a cloth until someone remembered it had value. I started doubting myself. I'd walk into a room and forget why I came in, and I'd think maybe they're right. Maybe I am tired. Maybe I do need to slow down. But the truth is, I wasn't tired. I was lonely. There's a difference. Tired is what you feel after living. Lonely is what you feel when the living keeps going without you. One afternoon, I was sitting in the guest house, flipping through a stack of old mail, when I came across a note I'd written myself months ago, a reminder to renew my license. I hadn't. No one had reminded me. No one had offered to take me. I stared at that note for a long time, not because I was confused, but because it felt like something important, like a thread leading to a room I hadn't entered in years. A room full of versions of me that still moved fast, still planned things, still mattered. That night I walked through the yard and stood by the back fence. The hydrangeas had bloomed. My husband used to love those. He planted them when we first bought the property. Said he liked how they changed color depending on the soil, blue in acid, pink in neutral. A flower that adapts. I wondered what color I'd be by now. I tried calling a friend the next morning, someone from my teaching days. We used to talk every week. I left a message. She didn't call back. I tried calling again a few days later. This time her husband answered. Said they thought I'd moved. That he hadn't seen any holiday cards from me the past year. Hadn't heard from me in months. I hadn't moved. I'd just stopped being visible. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone long after the line went dead. My eyes wandered to the window. The curtain moved in the breeze, just a little, like something breathing. That's when it began to settle. In my bones, this wasn't a pause. This wasn't temporary. I was being quietly erased, not with cruelty, not even with anger, just with convenience. The way you slowly delete old files from a hard drive. It's the way you toss clothes you haven't worn in a while. Not because they were bad, just because they no longer fit the life you think you deserve. I was no longer their center, not even their orbit. I had become a gentle obligation, something they managed between brunches and mortgage payments. And still, I kept baking muffins. I kept calling, kept smiling at the door, until that day I found the envelope, white, thick, addressed to me in my son's handwriting. It's tucked between an Amazon package and a coupon flyer. I remember the way my hand trembled as I opened it. Not because I expected bad news, but because something in me already knew. The signature at the bottom wasn't mine, but it looked close enough for a bank clerk to miss, close enough for a power shift to happen quietly, close enough for someone to say it was all a misunderstanding if I ever had the nerve to ask. But I didn't ask, not yet. Instead, I made tea the same way I always had, steeped for 5 minutes, a splash of milk, 2 sugars. I sat at the table with that envelope beside me like a guest I didn't invite, and I knew this wasn't about rest. It was about removal. They weren't waiting for me to fade. They were helping it along. It wasn't the envelope itself that scared me. It was how quiet it all was. How soft betrayal can sound when it's dressed up in formality. The letter inside was from a bank I hadn't used in years, one I thought had closed my account when my husband passed. But there it was, my name printed at the top, and below it, a confirmation of a beneficiary change. The details were vague, but the message was unmistakable. Control had shifted. The account, according to this letter, now had someone else tied to it, and my signature was at the bottom. Except I hadn't signed anything. Not in the last 6 months, not ever with that bank after I closed the account. I turned the paper over, hoping for a clue, a smudge, something. But the back was clean. It's just the faint imprint of a printer roller, like a trail leading nowhere. I pressed my fingers to the signature. It looked like mine. The shape of the letters, the loop of the R, the little tilt in the M. But it wasn't mine. There's a strange sort of pain in seeing a version of yourself you didn't create. I felt like I was staring at a copy of my handwriting in someone else's costume, close enough to fool a stranger, but not me. And that's what chilled me. It meant whoever did this wasn't just careless. They were calculated, okay? They knew how I signed my name, and they knew I wasn't looking. The envelope sat on the table like a stone dropped in still water. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, cup of tea gone cold beside me as the morning passed into afternoon. I watched the light crawl across the floor, turning soft and golden. The kind of light that used to make my son run barefoot through the house, chasing shadows and laughter. Where did that boy go? The one who used to beg for one more story at bedtime. The one who once gave me a card that said, "You're my everything," in crooked crayon. I reached into the drawer beside the table and pulled out my file folder, green tabs. Organized the way my husband used to call military tidy. Wills, titles, health proxies. Every important piece of paper I'd held on to since the year we bought the house. I started checking dates, signatures, authorizations. Some things were exactly as they should have been. Others weren't. I found a second account I hadn't known was still active. A dormant savings fund from when I used to teach, small but steady. I had opened it after my husband died just to have something that was mine, and it had been touched. The balance was lower than it should have been. That was when the kettle boiled over. I had put it on somewhere in the middle of this hunt. Just habit, something warm to hold in my hands. But I'd forgotten it entirely. The whistle screamed through the guest house like a siren, high and urgent. I ran to the stove and pulled it off the burner, the steam burning a line across my arm. Before I dropped the handle, it hissed as it settled. I stared at that kettle and felt the tears come. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that wreck your throat. It's just a slow, steady spill, like something inside me had finally sprung a leak. For the first time in months, I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall. Let myself feel the weight of everything I'd ignored. The questions I hadn't asked. The instincts I'd silenced. The excuses I'd made for him, for her, for everyone. I had spent years believing that love meant patience, that family meant forgiveness, that age meant surrender. But in that moment, staring at a fake signature and a nearly empty account, I realized something else. Love without respect isn't love. And forgiveness without honesty is just silence and surrender. Well, that's what they were counting on. I stayed up that night. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat by the window, watching the shadows move across the backyard. Hydrangeas were turning brown at the edges. No one had watered them in weeks. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but I didn't want to hear my own voice crack, so I wrote instead. I wrote a list of everything I still had in my name. The pension, the land title, the cabin upstate. No. One remembered I owned it. Had been in my family since before the war, passed down quietly from aunt to niece, kept in trust. Forgotten by most, I found the deed in an old box, yellowed but valid. My name. Just mine. That gave me a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Not the kind that makes noise. It's the kind that moves in silence. It's the kind that watches before it speaks. I opened the closet and pulled out a small suitcase. Not to leave, not yet, but to remind myself that I could. That night, I slept with the envelope under my pillow. Not out of fear. Out of resolve. Because by morning, I knew what I had to do. I had to find someone who could see through the mess. Someone who didn't need me to be soft, or quiet, or endlessly forgiving. I had to call the one person my son once said was two. Intense, too sharp, too old dash school. The lawyer they feared the most. James Alder. And when he picked up on the second ring and said my name, like he hadn't forgotten it, I felt my spine straighten. He asked if everything was all right. I told him the truth, no, but it will be. I hadn't spoken to James Alder in nearly 2 decades. He was our family lawyer once. Back when things were clearer, when my husband was still alive, when our son was still calling us every Sunday night just to say he'd made it through the week, James was never warm. He didn't offer you tea or ask about your grandchildren. But he listened like a courtroom depended on it. And he remembered things, the details most people lost in the fog of their own lives. He had drawn up the will after my husband passed, walked me through every clause like I was his only client. And when it was done, he looked me in the eye and said quietly that I should always keep copies somewhere no one could touch them. I had, when I heard his voice on the phone, steady, firm, the same deliberate cadence I remembered. Something in me steadied too. I didn't rush to explain. I didn't cry. Told him the facts. There's a bank letter, a forged signature, financial shift I didn't authorize. I believe someone in my family is trying to move my assets without my consent. There was a pause. Just a breath. Then he said, "Come in tomorrow. Bring everything." He gave me a new address. He'd left the big firm years ago, gone semi-retired, working out of a modest office above a flower shop on Main Street. I wrote it down in my notebook, the same one I used to keep grocery lists in when my son was little. That night, I gathered every file, every envelope, every printed bank statement. I didn't trust the online accounts anymore. Too many things vanish in a few keystrokes. I wanted paper, ink, the weight of truth in my hands. The next morning, I dressed with care. Not for vanity, for dignity. A pressed navy blouse, gray slacks, the coat with a deep inner pocket where I used to keep cough drops and tissues during PTA meetings. I looked in the mirror before I left and said aloud, "You are not imagining this." The streets were still, wet from the night's rain. I parked a block away and walked slowly, feeling each step beneath me like I was claiming the sidewalk. The flower shop downstairs smelled like lavender and soil. James looked older, but not smaller. His hair had gone from steel to snow, but his eyes were still sharp. He greeted me without pretense, said I looked well. I thanked him, but didn't pretend. We sat in a small office with wood-paneled walls and a single window cracked open to let the scent of petunias in. I laid out the documents between us. He read in silence. Occasionally he hummed low in his throat. The way he used to when the pieces started making sense. When he reached the forged signature, he held it up beside a known one. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "This was copied? Not sloppily, not by a stranger. This was done by someone who's watched you sign things for years." My stomach didn't twist. I was past that. He asked me who had access to my mail. I told him the truth. Technically, no one. But the main mailbox sits in front of the big house. Something arrived while I wasn't looking. It would be easy to collect it before I ever saw it. He nodded once, then asked me something I wasn't expecting. "Do you want to fix this quietly, or do you want it documented?" I asked him what the difference was. Quiet meant they stop. Know you're watching. You draw your line and hope they don't step over it again. Documented meant we put it on paper. Legal affidavits. Letters to banks. Protective actions. The kind of paper trail that can't be erased with an apology or a dinner invitation. I didn't hesitate. Document it. Every word. Every page. He smiled then, not kindly, but approvingly. The way a good teacher nods when a student finally stops asking for the answer and starts solving the problem. For the next hour, we went through every account, every authorization, every hint of movement they thought I wouldn't notice. James drafted letters while I talked. He printed forms while I pointed out dates. By noon, we had a binder labeled Estate Integrity RM with tabs for every category. He said he'd file initial alerts with the financial institutions. that he'd request voice confirmations on all accounts and freeze any pending transfers. He told me I'd need to sign a few new documents in person the following week, and he would be there, beside me. Then he slid a folder toward me. "This is your copy. Keep it. Carry it. You don't need to justify yourself to them." He paused before, adding, "If anyone tries to corner you again, call me. Say my name out loud in the room. It'll be enough." I walked out of that office taller than I'd entered. The binder felt heavier than it was, but not in a bad way. It was proof. It was protection. It was the first thing I'd held in months. That felt like it belonged entirely to me. As I drove home, I passed a billboard advertising a retirement home. A young woman hugging an older one, smiles wide. Words that promised dignity, comfort, safety. I wondered how many women looked at those signs while their families were forging signatures and whispering about memory loss behind their backs. I didn't cry on the drive back. I turned the radio off and rolled the window down. The air smelled like coming rain again, the kind that clears things out, not floods them. Back at the guest house, I sat at the table where the envelope had first arrived. I placed the new binder on top of it. One story covering another. I made tea, stirred it slowly, and when I lifted the cup to my lips, I wasn't shaking anymore. I didn't tell them that day. I let the silence stretch just a little longer. I wanted to see if they would come to me, tell the truth, or even ask how I was. They didn't. And that told me more than anything else. The silence after that was almost theatrical. Days passed without a knock at the door, without a text, without even the casual clink of dishes through the shared kitchen wall. It was as if, on some unconscious level, they knew I had stepped out of their script. They liked me better when I was passive, quiet, predictable. I'd given them the illusion of control for so long, they forgot it had been a gift. One I could take back. The binder stayed on the table like a guest that never left. I read through it each morning, not because I needed to, but because I could. Each page reminded me that I wasn't imagining it, that the things I doubted myself for noticing had weight, had legal shape and consequence. James had mailed out the first round of letters. Banks, investment firms, the county office. I had copies of each in my binder, thick ivory paper with clear language and sharper warnings. Everything notarized, everything signed. It's time by me. I didn't plan to go snooping, not exactly. But when trust is broken, you start noticing things. You hear footsteps differently. You listen for whispers under the breath. It was a Thursday morning when I overheard them again. I had stepped out to water the hydrangeas, the ones by the side fence, near the back corner where the guest house ends and their laundry room window begins. I heard her voice first, clipped, tired. She said she was tired of waiting, that I was dragging things out, that I wasn't cooperating the way they'd hoped. Then my son. A low murmur, followed by something sharper. He said I'd been acting strange. That maybe they should bring someone in, a doctor, something formal. I stood there with the watering can, paused midair, the cold metal against my palm grounding me. There it was, the plan, the suggestion, subtle enough to be denied, but clear enough for me to feel it in my chest. They wanted more than my money. Wanted the narrative to dot. If they couldn't move my accounts quietly, they'd go for the next best strategy, question my mind, make me doubt it too. I backed away from the window slowly, careful not to step on the gravel. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from fury. It's a terrifying thing to realize your own child is preparing a version of you that doesn't exist, one where you're confused, incapable, fragile. I spent the rest of that day in my room, binder on my lap. I read the section James had included about mental capacity, the thresholds, the protections, the protocols. I met every requirement, and I had proof. My doctor's letter, recent, clean, cognitively sound, physically mobile, emotionally stable. She even wrote, patient shows excellent memory retention and demonstrates full understanding of her affairs. I called James the next morning, told him what I'd overheard. He didn't react the way I expected, not with surprise, but with preparation. He said he'd draft an affidavit, a declaration of mental clarity signed by both myself and the doctor. He said we'd get ahead of it, put it in the binder, send it to the same people who'd received the asset alerts. He told me something else, too. It's not uncommon, he said. When money's involved and the parent doesn't comply, the next move is always the same. Paint them as confused. It's the oldest trick in the book. He didn't say it angrily, just like a man who's seen too much of it. And I knew then. This wasn't just my story. It was the story of every woman who gave everything away and was left with a single chair in the corner when the music stopped, so I got ahead of it. I gathered documents, old birthday cards with notes in my handwriting, journals, legal records, receipts I'd kept in dated folders. I scanned them, made copies, labeled each one. I updated the will, not out of spite, but out of precision. I added instructions, safeguards. I named James as executor. I listed every asset and removed all ambiguity. I wrote a letter too, not to them, to myself. A statement of intention. Why I was doing this. Why it mattered. James said it wasn't necessary, but I wanted it in the binder. My voice and my words. They didn't know yet. They still smiled when they passed me in the yard. Still waved with the same hollow pleasantries I played along. I smiled back, but I was watching every movement, every phrase. I started keeping a small notebook in my purse. Jotted down things they said, times, dates, little comments that alone were nothing, but together told the truth. She asked me one afternoon if I'd ever considered moving closer to town. Said it would be more convenient for everyone. I asked her who everyone was. She laughed and said, just people who care about you. I didn't laugh. I just nodded and went back to trimming the hydrangeas. That night I moved. The binder from the table to the suitcase in my closet. I packed it between a pair of slacks and the shawl my sister knitted me the year my husband died. I was getting ready, not for battle, for the moment when they'd finally try to push me out. Completely, and when they did, I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't cry. I would open the suitcase, take out the binder, remind them who they were dealing with. The confrontation didn't come with a knock. It came with a calendar invite. It arrived in my email late one night, long after they assumed I'd be asleep. The subject line read, family discussion, next steps. No body text. Just a time, a date, and their address, which I already knew by heart. I'd built that house with them, painted its walls, laid its floorboards, paid the down payment. I stared at the screen for a long time. The cursor blinked like a dare. There was a time I would have called to ask what it meant. But not anymore. Now, I knew what they were trying to orchestrate, a soft talk, a managed moment, a polite way to shift the narrative while controlling the outcome. They thought if they got me in their kitchen, poured me tea, called me mom in the right tone, I'd fold. They didn't know I'd already folded everything into a binder thicker than their wedding album. Still, I clicked accept. James insisted I'd be accompanied. He offered to come himself, in person. But I said no, not yet. I didn't want to walk in there with a shield unless they gave me a reason to lift it. But he made me promise to record the conversation and keep the binder within reach. I slipped it into a canvas tote bag and placed it beside the front door like an umbrella, just in case. That morning, I didn't wear anything loud. Just charcoal slacks, a burgundy sweater, and the earrings my husband gave me on our 25th anniversary. Small garnets, warm against my skin. I looked like myself, not the version they wanted to create. When I walked up the steps to their door, I noticed the hydrangeas again, wilted now. No one had touched them since the last rain. She opened the door with that smile. Wide, symmetrical, and completely detached. She gestured for me to come in, said something about how good I looked, how she was so glad we could finally have this moment. My son was already seated at the table I bought for them. Maple rounded edges, chairs that didn't scrape the floor. I had picked it out myself after he proposed, said it would hold every meal they'd share. I sat across from them, my tote bag on the floor beside my feet, One hand looped through the handle. They started slow. She talked about concern. That word again? She said they'd noticed I'd been acting differently, that I didn't come over as often. I seemed distant. I said I'd been busy, which was true. Then came his part. He said they loved me, that they just wanted to help. That they thought maybe it was time we all looked at what support might look like going forward. Support. I asked what that meant. He hesitated. Looked to her. She said calmly that they'd spoken to someone, a professional, about the possibility of like conservatorship. Just to help with day-to-day things, just to make sure everything stays in place. My pulse didn't rise. I looked at both of them and asked a single question. Was this your idea or hers? Neither answered. I reached down, lifted the tote bag onto the table, and placed the binder between us like a declaration. I opened it slowly, let the weight of the pages speak for me. I showed them the forged signature side by side with my actual one. I showed them the bank statement with the unauthorized transfer. I showed them the doctor's letter, signed and sealed. Then I took out the affidavit James had prepared and slid it across the table. I said, I am not confused. I am not unstable. And I am not going to sit here while you try to erase me for your convenience. They didn't speak right away. I watched the shift in their faces. My son's eyes dropped. She said I was overreacting, that it was just a conversation, that no decisions had been made. I said decisions had already been made. Behind closed doors, behind my back, and I was simply making mine in the open. She reached for the affidavit, but I pulled it back. I said she didn't need to read it. The banks already had their copies. So did the county clerk. So did James. My son looked at me then, really looked. And for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of the boy I raised. Not the man who sat in front of me now, weighed down by silence and suggestions. He opened his mouth, closed it, then said my name, not mom, not mother. My name, I said. You can love someone and still lose their trust. Once it's gone, it doesn't return with Sunday dinners and pretty lies. The silence that followed was intense. It was final. I gathered the binder, tucked it back into the tote, stood slowly, and looked around the room. Every object had my fingerprints on it. The couch, the photo frame, the ceramic dish by the door that held their keys. And yet I had never felt less at home. I said goodbye without hugging them. They didn't follow me to the door, back in the guest house. I placed the binder on the bed and sat beside it, my breath finally loosening, not from relief, but from reclaiming something I'd forgotten was still mine, my voice. They thought I would bend because I always had. They forgot I knew how to rise too. The morning after the confrontation, the house was quieter than usual. No soft thump of footsteps on the porch. No casual knock on the guest house door. Not even the pretense of a good morning text. They retreated without a word, and in their silence, I found more truth than I ever did in their smiles. They were regrouping. Apologizing that would have required a level of self-awareness neither of them seemed willing to reach. No, they were recalibrating, assessing what they could salvage, what they could still spin, and whether I would return to the easier version of myself, the one who gave without question, who nodded through discomfort, who cried behind closed doors so no one would feel guilty. But that woman was gone. I spent the next few days in motion, slow but deliberate. Not frantic, not emotional. Just steady. I visited my doctor again, brought a fresh stack of documentation. Not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted every piece in place. She looked me in the eye, gently held my hand as she signed the second affidavit and told me she was proud of me. I don't think anyone had said that to me in a very long time. I made a second appointment, this one with a real estate advisor. Not someone young or overly polite. I chose a woman in her 60s who had a reputation for being relentless in negotiations. She had gray roots, a thick leather planner, and didn't blink when I told her what I wanted. I want options. I want to know what my name can still buy me. And I want to see places where no one knows the sound of my silence. We visited 3 listings. I didn't fall in love with any of them. That wasn't the point. I just wanted to see what my freedom might look like in square footage. I wanted to picture myself in a space untouched by implication, where I wasn't someone's burden, or backup plan, or ghost in the garden. I also called the utilities company and changed the billing setup. The guest house had been tied to their main account. I made it separate. James helped me draw up a rental agreement, not because I needed their money, but because it was time the law matched the reality. I wasn't a guest, I was a legal occupant. And that came with rights they could no longer overlook. That particular move hit them harder than anything else. She came to the door 3 days later. Didn't knock, just stood there until I opened it. She said it was all getting a bit excessive, that we didn't need lawyers or paperwork or rental agreements to be a family, that she hoped we could return to something more harmonious, more civilized, she said. I let her speak. I didn't interrupt. Her voice was calm, like someone giving a weather report. And when she finished, I handed her the second copy of the lease agreement, signed, notarized, effective immediately. I said, quietly, harmony requires honesty. You forfeited that. She blinked at me like I'd spoken in a language she'd never bothered to learn. I closed the door gently. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out my husband's old ledger, the one he used to keep, track of home repairs, taxes, garden expenses. It still smelled faintly of pencil shavings and cologne. I ran my fingers along the yellowed pages, then turned to a blank one in the back, and I started my own list. What I still own, what they don't know, what I am reclaiming. It felt good to write it down. Not to prove anything, not to anyone else, but to see it in ink. A life still in motion. A woman still building, still naming things, still standing. I kept the binder. In my sight now. Sometimes on the kitchen counter, sometimes beside me on the porch. It wasn't just a shield, it was a record. A truth no longer hidden. I noticed that my son no longer made eye contact. When we crossed paths on the driveway, in the backyard, his gaze dropped to the ground. Not in shame, exactly. More like resignation, like he had picked a side and couldn't find his way back without burning the bridge he'd helped build. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask what I needed. He didn't ask what he'd done, and I didn't offer anything. I had learned that silence can be a kindness and sometimes a consequence. I began to reach out to people I'd let drift away, friends, cousins, a neighbor who used to walk with me every Thursday morning. One by one, I wrote letters, not emails, not texts, letters. I told them I was still here, still myself, still paying attention, and they responded. One sent me a book she thought I'd love. Another wrote back with news of her grandchildren. Third called, and we stayed on the phone for 2 hours, laughing about the time we accidentally locked ourselves in a church basement. They hadn't forgotten me. I had been hiding, disappearing inside someone else's comfort, letting myself be muted by the fear of being difficult. But not anymore. One evening, sat on the porch swing, the one I'd brought from my old house, the one they didn't want cluttering there. New aesthetic. The breeze was soft, the sky a pale watercolor of dusk. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, opened a book, and read until the stars came out. No one called for me, no one interrupted. No one needed me to shrink or soften. And, for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt solid. Rooted, unmistakably present. They thought they could erase me, but I had been writing myself in pencil. And now I had chosen ink. The moment that changed everything came in the form of a knock I wasn't expecting. Not from them. Not from anyone I owed or who owed me. It came from a woman holding a clipboard, her smile wide but formal. She introduced herself as someone from Adult Protective Services. She said she was just there to follow up. Just a routine wellness check. Nothing serious. I stood there in the doorway, my fingers still dusted with flour. I'd been baking again, something I hadn't done in weeks. The scent of cinnamon hung in the air like a memory, soft and stubborn. She glanced over my shoulder and asked if we could speak privately. I offered her a chair, poured 2 glasses of water, and waited. She took out a sheet from the folder. A report had been submitted anonymously. Claims of confusion, possible neglect of finances, withdrawal from family, increased isolation. I didn't laugh. I didn't even flinch. I just nodded once, calmly, and asked if she'd like to see my binder to her credit. She did. I brought it to the table and opened it to the tab labeled Affidavits. Then to the tab labeled Bank Communications. Then to the one titled Power of Attorney, Revoked and Reassigned. I let the documents speak. Not because I was trying to prove myself, but because this wasn't the first time I'd been quietly labeled without my consent. She read slowly. Her pen stilled. Her questions softened. She asked about my relationships with my son, with my daughter-in-law. I answered honestly. No venom, no drama. Just the truth. I told her how they had tried to make decisions without my knowledge, how they'd forged my signature, how they spoke around me and over me, but never to me. And I told her what I had done about it. She asked if I felt safe. I said, yes. Now I do. She smiled then, a different smile, not the practiced one, a real one. Said it was clear I was not only aware of my situation, I was managing it, protecting it. Before she left, she placed the paper back in her folder and said she'd be closing the case as unfounded. I thanked her. She paused at the door and added quietly, "You're not the first woman I've met in your position, but you're one of the few who documented everything before they came knocking." I watched her walk back toward the gate, clipboard hugged to her chest like a shield, and then I closed the door. It was never about proving I was capable. Known that it was about them not wanting me to be, because a capable woman is harder to control, harder to isolate, harder to rewrite. Later that evening, my son came by, not to apologize. Not exactly. He stood at the edge of the porch, hands in his pockets, like a child rehearsing a confession. He said he'd heard someone had come by, said he didn't know why, wasn't sure what had been said. I looked at him for a long time, not with anger, not even with sadness, with clarity. I told him I knew it was them, that I knew exactly what they'd tried to do, and that I would never let anyone else write the end of my story again. He didn't argue, he didn't deny, he just looked down, then asked if we could talk sometime. Really talk. I said, maybe, but not here, not in a house where I had been slowly erased. He nodded like he understood, and then he left. Not with a slam door or a last word, but with the quiet acceptance that the version of me they had relied on was gone. The next morning, I called James and told him it was time. We met at the office, same wood-paneled walls, same scent of fresh paper and aging books. He looked at me over the edge of his glasses and asked, "Are you ready?" I said, yes. We filed the final documents. The new will, the updated trust and the letter of intent to sell the main property. I had already lined up a buyer, someone kind. Someone who said she wanted a home with history and a garden that had loved many seasons. She hadn't blinked when I told her about the guest house. She just smiled and said, "It has its own soul, doesn't it?" "Yes," I said. I said, "It does." James handed me the last envelope, the formal transfer letter. I slipped it into my tote. Then I drove back, walked through the yard one last time. I touched the swing. I clipped a single hydrangea bloom and pressed it between the pages of my ledger, and I left a note on the kitchen counter. 2 lines. "The house belongs to someone else now. Please forward any mail." Then I walked out, not with triumph, but with peace. I checked into a small cottage near the lake that night. Just temporary, a soft landing before I decided what the rest of my life would look like. The woman at the desk called me Ms. instead of Mom. No one told me to rest. No one told me I was overreacting. I made myself tea, opened the window, watched the light stretch long across the water. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel watched or measured or diminished. I felt full, and I felt free. The lake air was different. It didn't carry expectation the way the backyard did. It didn't hum with whispers behind curtains or feel like it belonged to someone else. It smelled like pine and wet earth and the faint sweetness of wildflowers I couldn't name. It wrapped itself around me in the mornings when I opened the window, soft and steady, like something that had waited a long time for me to arrive. The cottage was small, but I didn't need much. Just a chair that didn't wobble, a kettle that didn't shriek, and space. Not just physical, but emotional. Space to breathe in full without bracing for disappointment. Space to take up room without apologizing for it. I stayed in silence. For the first few days, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to remember what my own voice sounded like when no one was there to dismiss it. I unpacked slowly, one sweater at a time. The binder came last. I placed it on the desk by the window, beside the little potted basil I bought from the local market. I didn't need to open it anymore. I just liked knowing it was there. My life documented, protected. Name Dot, it didn't take long for word to spread. A cousin called after seeing the property listing online. She asked if everything was okay. I told her everything was finally honest. She was quiet for a moment, then said she understood more than I realized. I got 2 letters the next week. One from an old friend, someone I hadn't seen since my teaching days, and one from a neighbor I'd barely spoken to but who remembered the bread I used to bake. Both said they were proud of me. Both said they'd been watching quietly. One wrote, "It takes strength to leave, but even more to stay gone." That one stayed with me. My daughter-in-law didn't reach out, not a call, not a message, not even a line of false pleasantries. I didn't expect her to. Women like her rarely acknowledge when a plan falls apart. They rebuild their reality like a house of cards, new angles, new stories. I imagine she tells people I needed a change of pace, or that I moved to be closer to nature. Maybe she even paints herself as generous for giving me space. But it doesn't matter, because I stopped living in the versions of myself they constructed. I didn't hear from my son for almost a month. And then one evening, while I was reading, on the porch, my phone lit up. K-text. Short, hesitant. "Can I come see you? Alone." I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't know my answer, but because I needed a moment to mourn the version of him I'd raised, the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after bedtime stories, the young man who once cried in my arms when his first job offer came in, the son who for a time treated my presence as a given and my love as a certainty. That boy was gone, but perhaps ain't the man who texted me now. There was a fragment of him still trying to surface. I replied with a time and nothing more. When he arrived, he looked older than I remembered, not in years, but in weight. He carried something now regret, maybe, or the burden of having finally seen what he had become. He didn't try to hug me, didn't bring excuses. He just stood on the steps, eyes glassy, hands in his pockets like he was bracing for a verdict. I invited him in. We sat at the small table by the window. The kettle hissed behind me, the room warm with ginger and lemon. He looked around at the space, said it suited me. I said, "Yes, it does." And then we sat in a long silence. He eventually spoke. He said he didn't realize how far it had gone, that it had all felt gradual, like boiling water, that she'd made things sound practical, helpful, even necessary, and that he hadn't questioned it the way he should have. I let him speak. I didn't cry. He apologized for the signatures, for the silence, for standing beside someone who had treated me like a shadow and calling it love. I asked him why. He said it was easier. He said he thought I wouldn't notice. He said he didn't want to lose peace in his home. And then I asked, "And what about mine?" That was the only time he looked away. I told him I wasn't angry anymore, but I was changed. That trust, once taken, doesn't come back in full. That forgiveness isn't the same as return. That I would always be his mother, but not his caretaker, not his fallback, not the woman in the corner waiting to be invited back into relevance. He nodded. He asked if we could try again. Slowly, I said we could talk again. Slowly, and that would have to be enough if he meant it. He left without pressing for more. And as the door closed behind him, I sat back in the chair and felt something shift. Not closure, not victory, but an opening. A space that once held pain, now held possibility. Not because he changed, but because I had, that night. I wrote in my journal. Today I told the truth with a steady voice. And no one interrupted me. I went to bed with the windows open. The lake was still. The sky wide and forgiving, and for the first time in a very long time, slept without checking the locks. The strange thing about peace is that you almost don't trust it when it first arrives. I woke early the next morning. Not because something startled me, but because my body hadn't yet learned it was allowed to rest. For so many years, I'd been a light sleeper listening for the click of the front door, the rustle of bags outside my window, the tone of voices I wasn't supposed to hear. Now there was nothing but the gentle hush of water touching the shore, and birdsong I couldn't name. I stood in the kitchen barefoot, holding my cup of tea, and stared out the window. The lake didn't shimmer like it does in the movies. It just held the light quietly, like it wasn't trying to be anything other than itself. I wasn't used to that either, being allowed to just be. I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The wood was cold underfoot. There was a single cloud stretching wide above the trees, and in that moment I remember thinking, this is what absence feels like when it's earned. Not loneliness, not banishment, just absence. A clearing. A room inside the soul where things are no longer jostled by others' needs. I hadn't spoken to my son since that day on the porch. He hadn't followed up, and I hadn't expected him to. I think we both understood what we had exchanged. Not reconciliation, not repair, a kind of ceasefire. And it was enough for now. I began building new rituals. Little things, nothing grand, a walk to the mailbox each morning. A slice of bread toasted just right, eaten slowly with fig jam I found at a roadside stand. A notebook beside my bed where I wrote down one true sentence each night before sleep. Some nights the sentence was soft. Today I felt the breeze in my bones. Some nights it was sharper. No one can love you right if they only love you when you're quiet. And some nights the sentence didn't come at all. But I left the page open anyway. Because some silences deserve to be acknowledged, too. I started saying yes to things again. Cape pottery class on Tuesday afternoons. A lunch invitation from the woman 2 doors down who smelled like honey and wore her gray hair in a braid. Down her back, she reminded me that you don't have to share blood to feel seen. One afternoon, I wandered into a thrift shop tucked behind the bakery. I wasn't looking for anything. I rarely am these days. But on a dusty shelf near the back, I found a small wooden box with a broken clasp. Inside was a deck of mismatched recipe cards, some typed, some handwritten, some barely legible. They weren't worth anything, not really. But they felt like proof that someone somewhere had once made meals for people who maybe didn't always say thank you either. I bought them, took them home, placed them on the counter next to my old kettle, and thought, I still have more meals in me. One evening, James called. Not about paperwork, not about signatures or reversals or next steps, just to check in. He asked how the cottage was treating me. I said it was quiet in the right places. He chuckled and said that was the best kind of quiet. Then, after a pause, he asked if I was still carrying the binder around. I told him, no, it sits on the shelf now, between a cookbook and a poetry collection. Not hidden, but no longer on guard. He said that meant we'd done our job right. Then he told me something I won't forget. He said, most women don't realize the power they hold until someone tries to take it away. You realized it. And you used it with grace. We didn't say goodbye. Just drifted off the call with the easy kind of silence people earn. Later that night, stood on the back porch again, wrapped in the same shawl I'd packed months ago. It still smelled faintly of cardamom and lavender. The air was cool, but not biting. It's a kind of cool that reminds you you're alive. And I found myself remembering the first time I realized I was disappearing. It wasn't dramatic. There was no slammed door, no raised voice. It was a canceled dinner, a missing photo on the wall, a joke told like I wasn't in the room. People assume betrayal comes like a storm, but more often it arrives like fog, slow, quiet. It wraps itself around you until you can't see your own outline. But now I could. I saw myself clearly, not just as a mother, or a wife, or a woman who once packed lunches and kept everyone else's lives from falling apart, but as someone who still had a life, one that didn't need permission to matter. The next morning, I put on a pair of sturdy shoes, laced them tight, and walked into town. Not for any reason, just to feel the rhythm of the sidewalk under my feet. I stopped by the post office, sent a letter to a friend who'd moved to Oregon years ago. The note was short. It said, I left, finally, and I didn't cry this time. On my way home, I passed a bookstore with a chalkboard out front. The quote of the day read, "It's never too late to reclaim your name." I stood there a long time, just watching those words. I didn't take a photo. I didn't need to. They'd already made their way into me. The seasons began to turn slowly. The lake, once a still sheet of silver under summer light, grew darker, more contemplative. The wind had more to say in October. It moved through the trees in long, careful sentences. Leaves fell at their own pace, some clinging longer than others, but eventually all letting go. I watched from the kitchen window most mornings, wrapped in a cardigan with a chipped mug in my hands. It was the same mug I'd brought from the old house, the one with a small crack near the rim. My son had once told me to throw it away, that it looked tired. I kept it. Some things are allowed to be tired and still loved. That month, I began making soup again. Lentil, mostly. Sometimes carrot ginger. Once even split pea with the exact spice blend my mother taught me in a kitchen I can't return to. It's strange how food makes memory tasteable. I'd stand at the stove stirring and see myself 10 years younger, 20 pounds lighter, humming under my breath while waiting for the broth to thicken. I didn't miss that woman. I just honored her. She did what she had to do, but I don't stir with urgency anymore. Stir slowly. I stir for myself. One afternoon, I drove to the local hardware store and bought a brass nameplate. I had it engraved with one word, mine. I screwed it into the front door of the cottage myself, right above the handle. Not for anyone else. Just for me. So every time I returned home, I'd see it and remember that I had chosen this life, this space, this quiet, because for too many years, I had lived in borrowed rooms, in roles handed to me like scripts I hadn't written now. Finally, the lines were mine. I got a letter from my son, handwritten. I wasn't expecting that. He said he understood now that it wasn't just the actions, it was the dismissal. It's the easy way he'd accepted my erasure. It's the way he let someone else decide what I could handle, how much I should own, where I should live. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He asked to be remembered, and he included a photo, an old one I'd thought was long lost. It was the two of us at the beach. He must have been 9 or 10. I had on a sun hat and sunglasses, and he was burying my feet in the sand. We were both laughing, really laughing. My head was thrown back, and his mouth was wide open in a grin that didn't yet know how to hold back. He wrote on the back, "I want to earn my way back to her." I sat with that for a long time. I didn't cry, but I let the feeling move through me like waves, like weather, because forgiveness isn't a switch. It's a slow unfolding, and some wounds don't close neatly. Some stay tender even after they've healed, and that's all right. I wrote him back the next morning, told him I appreciated the letter, told him I remembered that day on the beach, told him I was still learning how to trust again, and that trust would look different now, if and when it returned. But I told him this too. I don't hate you. I just needed to choose myself after years of being everyone else's solution. I placed the letter in the mailbox and walked back up the gravel path. the crunch of leaves beneath my shoes reminding me how much I'd once missed the sound of seasons at night. I sometimes dream of the past, not in color, not with faces, but in sensations, the heat of a stove, the scent of soap, the creak of a stair. I don't wake from those dreams with longing anymore. I wake steady. This is what happens when you leave before the house burns down. You save yourself in time. I hadn't realized how much. I'd shrunk inside their version of me, the woman who didn't need full access to her own accounts, the woman who was tired every time she asked for something they didn't want to give, the woman who was easier to manage if she was fragile. I'm not fragile. I'm 68 years old. And I carry my own groceries and change my own light bulbs and read the fine print. I am not confused. I am not burdensome. And I am not anyone's liability. I spoke at the town library last week. They were hosting a reading group about inheritance and identity. And someone had mentioned my story vaguely without naming names. They asked if I'd share my experience. I said yes. I stood behind a wooden podium in a room filled with women, most of them older, some younger, all nodding like they already knew the ending to the story I hadn't even begun to tell. And I told them everything. Not the details of the betrayal, that wasn't the point. I told them how quiet erasure can be. It's how easy it is to vanish when you've been taught that love means staying quiet. How important it is to write your own ending. In ink with full sentences and a title you choose yourself. Afterward, a woman came up to me. She was maybe 75. She pressed a card into my hand and whispered, I thought I was the only one. I told her none of us are. We just forget sometimes that we are still allowed to take up space. That night, I hung the photo from the beach on the cottage wall. Not to forgive the past, but to remind myself of who I've always been underneath it. Laughing, rooted, completely unashamed, and finally mine. The snow arrived before I was ready, but not before I was prepared. I had stocked the pantry in small, careful waves, a few cans at a time, boxes of tea, bags of rice. Had never done winter alone before, not like this. Not without the background noise of someone else's footsteps. But I welcomed the quiet. I lit candles in the evening, kept a kettle warm on the stove, and watched the world outside slow to a hush. There's a kind of silence that feels like absence, and then there's the kind that feels like peace. I had lived in both. Now I finally knew the difference. By December, I had a rhythm. Mornings spent with wool socks and library books. Afternoons walking along the lake path, the wind stinging, but never cruel. I kept my phone on, but I rarely checked it. I didn't dread its ringing anymore. Mostly, it didn't ring at all. And that, too, was its own sort of freedom. One day, I found a letter in the mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single page, typed, "You were right to leave. I never should have let it get that far. If you ever want to talk again, I'll be here. I'll wait as long as it takes." There was no name, but I knew the handwriting on the envelope. I placed the letter in the drawer beside my bed, not out of hope, not out of pain, just to keep it, just in case. Not all broken things need to be repaired, but some deserve a place in the archive of your survival. Around the holidays, neighbors dropped off small things. A jar of jam, a scarf, a pine-scented candle. No obligation. Just kindness, wrapped in quiet gestures. I had grown so used to giving without receiving that these small gifts nearly undid me. I thanked them, with cards, with cookies. With presents, it's funny when you stop needing to prove yourself. You start showing up in ways that feel whole. One neighbor, Maggie, invited me to her daughter's Christmas concert at the town hall. She said it would mean a lot if I came. The girl didn't have a grandmother around, and she liked the way I listened. So I went, sat in the third row, clapped like it mattered, because it did. Afterward, the little girl ran up to me and said she was glad I was there, but I had the kindest eyes in the room. I smiled, blinked fast to hold the tears back. I had forgotten how much it means to be noticed in a room not expecting you. There was no family Christmas this year. No invitation. No explanation. Just absence. One I didn't chase or try to fill. Instead, I decorated the cottage in simple ways. An evergreen branch above the window. A line of tiny gold stars across the mantel. I made mulled wine and sipped it slowly while watching snow fall in the hush of evening. No carols, no chaos. Just warmth. I sent no cards. I wrote no long emails. To explain myself, I owed no one my undoing. But I wrote one letter. Not to send, just for me. It said you did not imagine it. You did not overreact. You did not fail them. They failed to recognize you. I folded it and placed it beneath the brass nameplate on my desk. Not as proof. It's a reminder that healing isn't always about feeling better. Sometimes it's just about feeling real again. In January, I started journaling every morning. Just one page, a practice in presence. Some entries were soft grocery lists, notes about the weather. Others were sharper, pieces of memory returning in fragments. It's the sound of her voice when she told me to rest. The look on his face when I handed him the lease. I didn't dwell. I didn't rewrite. I just wrote it down and let it go. One morning, after a particularly crisp walk, I found myself humming an old tune I used to sing to my son when he couldn't sleep. I hadn't thought of that melody in years. It didn't hurt hearing it again. Felt like a thread from a version of me who still believed in bedtime stories and forgiveness. Maybe some things don't go away. Maybe they just settle differently. And maybe that's okay. There are people who will never say sorry, who will twist your strength into selfishness and call your boundaries betrayal. But there are others, even strangers, who will see you just as you are and say, "I'm glad you're still here." Maggie said that to me once, handing me a loaf of bread on a cold afternoon. "I'm glad you're still here," and she meant it not because she needed anything from me. Not because I proved anything, but simply because I existed fully, fiercely, without apology. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. I lit a candle that evening and watched the flame hold. Steady in the still room. I was not waiting for anyone. I was not performing. I was not unraveling. I was simply sitting in a life I had built with my own hands after everything fell apart. And it was more than enough. Spring didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in gradually, like someone entering a room softly, unsure whether they're welcome. I noticed it first in the way the lake thawed. The ice, once solid and unyielding, began to shimmer at the edges. Patches of dark water opened up, like eyes slowly waking. Birds returned in pairs. Daffodils pushed through the soil near the porch, fragile but insistent. I opened my windows again. Not all the way, just enough for the breeze to whisper in. Some mornings I'd wake before the sun, wrapped in the quiet. I no longer reached for my phone or hurried to start the kettle. I just lay there, still and aware, knowing there was no one expecting me, no one hovering. It was a kind of freedom that didn't sparkle or shout. It just breathed with me. I had started painting again. Nothing elaborate, just watercolors on thick paper, shapes, colors, sometimes memories. One morning, I painted the bench from my old backyard, the one they said didn't match. I painted it in gold. Let it shine. It's strange. The things you miss once you stop being asked to justify them. The last time I saw my son, he brought a book. Not as a gift, but as a symbol. He said he'd been reading about boundaries, about trust. That he was trying to understand. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't ask for my forgiveness. He just asked if he could sit with me a while. So we did, on the porch. 2 chairs, a pot of tea between us, and a quiet that didn't feel loaded. He looked older, tired in a way that couldn't be slept off. I didn't ask how things were at home. I didn't ask if she knew he was here. I didn't need to. He told me he still remembered the smell of cinnamon in my kitchen when he was 7. That he used to think love was when people always stayed. But now, he said, he realized that sometimes love is choosing yourself before someone else takes everything. I said nothing for a while. Just listened to the birds. Then I told him something I hadn't meant to say, but once I heard it in my own voice, I knew it was true. I said, "You didn't lose me when I left. You lost me when I stopped feeling safe in your presence." And I only left because I finally believed that. He didn't argue, didn't defend. He just nodded, and when he left that afternoon, he hugged me. Not out of guilt, not out of ritual. Because something in him still remembered how. He still calls now and then. Sometimes he sends a recipe, a photo, a line from a book he thinks I'd like. It's quiet, careful, but real. I don't call back every time. It's not punishment. It's protection. I decide what comes in now. The woman I used to be would have checked the door every 10 minutes. Waited for an invitation back. Tried to explain why she needed what she needed. This woman watches the sunset in silence and feels no need to be explained. I updated the binder last month. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because I was thorough. I added a new page, handwritten, titled "Where I Keep the Light." I listed everything that brings me home to myself. The lake in the early morning, the smell of garlic on my fingers, my mother's locket. Even though it doesn't open. The softness of hand-washed sweaters, the sound of a letter being opened, the silence I earned at the bottom. I wrote, "If you find this and I'm gone, know that I left with both feet on the ground. I don't know where I'll be 10 years from now, but I know I won't be erased. Not again, because the world may not always reward a woman who refuses to disappear. But she will sleep deeply, and she will dream in color. Sometimes when I sit on the porch at dusk, I think of the versions of myself that didn't make it. The one who nearly agreed to a conservatorship. The one who almost stayed quiet. The one who kept shrinking so her love wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. I grieve her gently. Then I let her go because she walked me to the edge. And then, finally, I walked myself back. Now I'm curious about you. Have you ever experienced something like this? Let me know in the comments. And if you stayed with me until now, thank you. I'll leave you with 2 other stories I think you'll love.